You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome. Today we have two very exciting topics for you. One of them is about how generative AI is changing the world of travel planning and how to overcome the challenges of operationalizing such incredible applications. The second topic is one about the Chief Data and Analytics Officer. How is it different in a digitally native tech company versus in traditional companies? And the person who brings all of those together is Rahul Todkar. He is the head of data and AI at Tripadvisor. He's previously the head of data science and go-to-market at LinkedIn. He has a long career in financial services, Intuit, PayPal, Capital One, etc. And we're extremely fortunate to have him. Rahul, thank you very much for joining us on the Data Science Leaders podcast.
Thank you, and glad to be here.
Well, I would love to talk about generative AI at Tripadvisor because as I remember it, Tripadvisor was very, very early on in this journey in terms of like production applications that were going to out and that customers could engage with. I think yours was probably one of the very first available, I think, already in July.
Yes. So what I would say is absolutely. We weren't probably the very first out of the gates as, we saw a lot of applications coming out of ChatGPT or GPT-powered applications. But I would say we were one of the first companies to think about trip planning as a holistic use case powered by generative AI. And that's where we've taken the time to think about what it means from a traveler expectation standpoint. What is the right UI and experience looks like? What are the right components to bring together from a generative AI standpoint? And when it all comes together, what would that look like? So, I'm very excited and proud of the work we've done, but that's where we are leading with that kind of a very holistic approach towards trip planning.
Well, and it seems to have been extraordinarily successful. We came across a survey just recently from Oliver Wyman, which was saying that 1/3 of leisure travelers in the US and Canada have leveraged a generative AI tool. And the numbers are extraordinary in terms of like over 80% taking more than half of those recommendations, et cetera. So could you share, what were the secrets behind that? How do you create a generative AI application that gets not that kind of one-off adoption, but also adoption plus trust?
This has been an interesting and very, very fascinating journey, right? When you think about a brand like Tripadvisor, which has been top of mind from an awareness standpoint, from the love and the engagement the brand gets, it's phenomenal, right? And when not just the brand and the aspect of what brand stands for, but when you look at what Tripadvisor from a data standpoint has, which is just the prerequisite for any AI or generative AI application. But just to kind of share some numbers, we're looking at about 300 to 400 million monthly active users, a billion plus reviews. We are looking at 300,000 plus bookable experiences, things you can do when you're on a trip. Accommodations, you have 4 million plus restaurants. We have 58,000 plus small business operators on the platform. So the first biggest success or the biggest ingredient of this recipe is starting with your first party data. And when you have that depth and breadth of data, this is where it just truly becomes pretty powerful to build these applications. So that's primarily number one thing I would say that. Then you layer on top of that, how do you think about the brand trust and what you can do from a community standpoint? How do you bring in the community content and forums and reviews and their feedback into consideration? And all that, you package that into a very specific user-driven approach from a UX standpoint. So first-party data, you bring in the components from the community and user trust together, and you have a massive cross-functional team building on that. It just really creates a great application.
Well, there's an element of the stars aligning when it comes to the use case and the prerequisites for it. So as you're saying, in terms of generative AI applications seem to be particularly powerful when it comes to going in and being able to discover data, summarize data, interact with data. And that's a key element of the services that you're always providing was reviews around hotels, landmarks, things to go and see. And so generative AI sort of slotted in very nicely in terms of a clear problem or a clear opportunity to help folks go in and engage with that. content very well. But, having the prerequisites for it is very, very different from actually going in and being able to execute on this. And I would imagine a key concern was sort of trust, that willingness to hit the release button on the part of leadership on this. What made that possible?
I would say there's a couple of considerations. One is that when you truly think from our traveler or customer standpoint, one fact was that we have lots of data, lots of reviews. You think about reviews and forums and that I mentioned earlier in terms of numbers, but just truly the fact was we weren't able to fully leverage those reviews and share that in a meaningful way to our end users, right? Because when you have a billion reviews, it's fantastic. But when just really, how do you package and summarize that and make it available, right? Because that onus, otherwise, it's really on the end user's shoulders. Let's say I'm planning a 5-day trip to Hawaii, and I'm looking at a hotel which is beach facing, has an easier walk, is also pet friendly. Some of the restaurants or things I want to eat are close by. All those things you layer on. It's not just a filter. You cannot layer on a bunch of filters, but rather what ends up happening, and eventually all of us when you're planning for trips, is you read up those reviews yourself and you spend time like, okay, let me figure out this and compare that and understand what I want to do. But what we've done is really thought about what is at the heart of what our users want. And when you look at that and try to package and summarize this information using generative AI, you just really then presenting it that really helps build on that trust. So first and foremost is thinking about from a user standpoint, number one. And number two is it's not 100% automated, where we have, let's call it human in the loop approach, where we do have a very strict quality control, understanding of the results, how we're presenting those results. Are we really looking at hallucinations? What's the factor? Like there's multiple level of quality control that we layer on top of our generative AI output so that we can continue to build on that trust. So when you look at these two aspects, right, really thinking from a user standpoint and solving for the key pain points, and secondly, at the same time, having a right combination of technology and human in the loop, it just helps you build and earn that trust from users.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, it does sound like a key aspect of reducing any risk off of this is the way in which you're using it. So you don't have to worry about hallucinations when it comes to hallucinating new places or hallucinations that are potentially factual ones, because you can go in and use presumably something like retrieval augmented generation or something like that, where you are constraining it to go in and describe real world places and be able to link to further information about those real world places. So in a sense, it sounds like there's ways in which you can control the experience by leveraging generative AI for what it's good at, which is, creating the summaries, creating the verbiage and presentation, but at the same time using that first party highly curated data.
Yes.
So it sounds like there's one element to that, but it also sounds like, how is there a human in the loop when it comes to the Gen AI application itself?
It's more on the quality control side, right? Especially for trip planning as a use case, it's more to control the output and not just control, but to understand, is the output, are the recommendations generally on point, right? Is the model output, any model you take, when it's spitting out a 5-day, 7-day itinerary, does that generally seem right? I mean, what you're alluding earlier, let's say, hey, if you're looking at certain places, we try to augment that through RAGs or otherwise. You do a lot of prompt engineering ahead of time to really get the best results. But still, there's an element where when you get and presented with those results, are those generally where we want? Like not just the results, because I think the LMs have been fantastic. When we've seen there's not much issue with recommending a place or a sequence of activities, but the narration, the description around that is where we've seen there's certain elements of superfluous content or wordings. I mean, even that to that level, we want to be really making sure that fits our brand and how we want to present that. So what we have in place is those quality control aspects, which just from a human standpoint, if you would have to, or a person who is knowledgeable in creating these trips, if they would have to recommend to our end users, how would they recommend that? And so we have some element of quality control at scale. Obviously, it's not every single trip, but just really making sure that we are constantly providing that feedback, that mechanism by which we can make the entire process even much more better and a really great, delightful experience for our users.
It makes sense. What often gets overlooked in all of this is just the mechanics of operationalizing a application like this at the kind of scale that you would need to in order to be able to support this number of users. Any challenges that you guys face there in terms of turning this into a production application, and any suggestions to folks who run into similar challenges?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, this has been a journey full of a lot of learnings, a lot of changes, a lot of iterations. I would say the main challenges I would summarize are in probably three buckets. Number one is around your first party data, right? I mean, we talked, and again, I feel like, and you've been in the industry for long enough to know, we've all talked about, hey, we should get our data with fantastic quality, all in data in one place, with a higher degree of accuracy, reliability, with some kind of taxonomy, metadata, cataloging on it. This has been in discussion, I mean, forever is what I feel like. But now it just puts that more in focus. Because again, with Gen AI, with any AI for that matter, what you need is a really solid feature store or your data in a fantastic place. So it's not a new finding by any means, but it's just the fact that as you're thinking about building AI applications, this need, even more so in coming months and quarters, will be an important aspect of it. So as we are looking at how do we inject our data more in from prompts or rags or other ways, or even at some point fine tuning or even just whatever we want to do, this aspect becomes even more important. So that was the learning or challenge and learning number one, which is really your first party data is gold. And you have to take care of that with utmost effort or as much as you can focus on that. So that's one. Second, I would say challenge and opportunity is around quality control with any GenAI application is really paramount, right? And when I say quality control, it's on both the input side and on the output side. Output side is we just were talking a bit earlier in terms of like when you get the results from a particular large language model, right? What kind of output are you getting? Is that generally you have to have some ways of comparing, contrasting it. You might want to really ensure accuracies at some level and see if it fits your expectations, but also does it match your customer expectations? Is it on brand? So that's on the output side, quality control. And same thing on the input side. What and how you are sharing or injecting prompts or what kind of inputs you're pushing into an LLM. Really, what kind of experimentation you're thinking about in that space. Because again, as you know, especially on the prompt engineering side, you could tweak a prompt and you can certainly get different results. So, how do you want to change and play around with that so that you can get a result which meets your expectation? So, I would say quality control on the input and output side is a big learning. I would say would not say by any means it's a solved challenge. We are working through that. Experimentation in this space is not straightforward. That's an area of also getting better. So that's number two. And number three, just an opportunity or just a learning is that this is a big team effort, right? Any productionizing any Gen AI application right now, you need right from your product teams to different engineering teams. Ended up working a lot with our cloud operations team. How do you think about and what kind of cloud infrastructure you want? How do you want to tweak that? How do you want to do different things in there? What kind of QA you want on this? Something which is more manual but also more automated. How do you think about really getting different operations team into the mix? How do you think of in the marketing and what role? So not to say that it's not a surprise, but again, often whenever I talk about Gen AI applications, it tends to feel like, oh, okay, here's a few teams, and the AI teams in particular can just like create an application and launch it. No, if you really think of a production application, it is a production application with that many cross-functional partners and teams working together.
Well, starting, I guess, with the last of those challenges, best practices first, I was curious the role of the data science and AI teams in this, in coordinating this and pulling this together. Because I certainly see in the generative AI space, usually the less sophisticated organizations, but many of them are hoping that they don't need those kinds of traditional capabilities around for ML engineering, ML ops, or indeed for data science. They're hoping that they can just connect business user teams with developer teams and that amazing things will happen. It doesn't sound like that was what was happening here. And I guess I was curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And even just to kind of further click into that or unpack it, I would say even on the data team, we had 4 roles or 4 personas or types of skill sets to make this production-based application. One is obviously a classic AI scientist role, the team or the person who is building these models, looking at prompts, looking at fine tuning, whatever it need be, really looking at that. That's one, the AI scientists, AI engineers. Second, working hand in hand with those is ML ops engineers, machine learning operations. So that's a big focus, and especially for us. And I do think it should be in the industry as well, where it's not about taking a model and really building and trying to launch a model, but really thinking about that as a production ready application in the flow. So you need that ML ops person. And then you need a data engineering person to really think about the data that's an input, right? Which is historically been a different, obviously disconnected in some sense, but I would say especially now in this case, you do need that a really solid, accurate, reliable, quality control data pipeline coming in. So that's data engineer as a third role. And last but not least is analytics. Somebody who is able to look at that from a metric standpoint and dashboards and insights and experimentation. Because it's not enough to launch a model and say, hey, here's what it is, and here's my application is what it's going to do. But there are a lot of insights and metrics that you could and should optimize as you launch production grade applications.
Well, I'm imagining in the case of this team, it's probably not like most of any of those roles were really familiar with large language models going into this, because presumably development of this must have at the latest would have happened in March or April, and large language models weren't really on most people's radar prior to the launch of ChatGPT. So I guess some folks would come in and say, well, but the AI scientist wasn't trained on these, the data engineer wasn't familiar with these, the ML engineer wasn't used to operationalizing these models. But I guess what we'd probably say is, well, yes, but they're the ones who are best able to learn all of those and are best familiar with pitfalls off of this, versus hoping that a developer team would go in and be able to learn and read up on this and master those skills enough. Is that roughly correct, or is it changing?
It is definitely changing. But one small caveat is that the large language models, I mean, we all know that, there's been existence in for a long time. What I would say is generally you would have the data scientists or AI engineers more familiar working on these models than anybody else. That crew, that particular team or skill or role was more familiar with this. I mean, you think of a natural language processing, now.
Probably been using BERT models for a few years right now. It's a hop, skip, and a jump.
Very specific applications, maybe in the chatbot, maybe in the intent detection, maybe in this text summarization in a very limited use case, or sentiment analysis. These things have been around for a long time. So those aren't really truly near real-time, production-grade applications of these large language models in this particular way we are describing it. And so you didn't have to involve a broader set of either data roles or even broader company or cross-functional teams roles in this capacity. So to your point, what you're saying is that is largely true in this capacity, in this particular context, where the data science teams are familiar with some aspect of this and doing that in a very small or limited capacity. But when you think of the broader applications, all these roles have to be really thinking about what does that mean now, right? If you're building and launching a generative AI-based application, what do we need to do differently? But again, these are the skills or roles which are more familiar with building and working with data. And so it's a great place to start, right, with these teams and say, here's what you're trying to do and here's how we can launch it. And so that's the kind of approach we took as well.
It makes sense. Curious, when it comes to the data challenge, you were talking about the importance of investing in your data. I'm just curious whether or not some of these applications actually take you in a different turn, in the sense of you've been curating data and making available data, but now you're looking to make it available in a different way and creating a data architecture that has different characteristics.
You tend to discover along your journey, you do need a more flexible data platform or data architecture, right? Because again, large language models have a capacity, I mean, I won't say infinite, but just obviously infinite as it asterisk to your GPU and your cost parameters, right? So that's what you have to think about. But more importantly, they can ingest a lot of data, a lot of knowledge, a lot of structured inputs, textual inputs, what sort of inputs. I mean, you're looking at even images and PDFs and all sorts of inputs that can be ingested into LLMs. The key is, and that's even more the reason why your data platforms, your architecture has to be flexible enough to understand and address that. And so again, that's a progressive learning. We didn't come up with that or get to that on day one or month one, but rather we said we started as anybody was it was your classical feature store approach. Here's your feature store with these many data elements. Let's try to see what we can do there. Here's what we can push more from a prompt standpoint. What do we know about the users? Here's certain thing we can push from a RAG standpoint as a data set. So you start approaching, or your first, it's a bit of a crawl, walk, run. You start in that fashion, but then you quickly realize, you know what, you can push in a lot more data. But again, it has to be some kind of a metadata, some kind of a schema that you have to think about on your overall data. And the applications, the output become much more powerful when you have that flexibility in your data architecture.
Makes sense. You mentioned cost. I was curious whether or not there was any concerns up front that folks were worried, well, we're going to be a victim of our own success. Folks are going to use this to such a degree that it's going to be massively expensive for us. Or was it one, it's cheap enough, or two, were there things that you had to do in order to make sure that it was designed in a way that could minimize the cost impact?
Yeah, cost has been definitely a consideration for us. In addition to cost, accuracy and latency have been two other parameters I've been thinking and watching very closely, right? When we're building GenAI applications, because that's how you can really get the most out of it and also really not have to worry too much about any one aspect in particular. So hence it was one of our kind of design choices or considerations from the get-go. It's the number one. Based on that, especially on the cost side of the house, we've done a lot of different combinations or permutations to make sure cost stays within reason. Right? This is like, hey, what kind of models we use? Do you want you use something open source? If you're using something from proprietary APIs and models, which ones do you use? Do you use GPT-4 or 3.5 Turbo? The cost difference is substantial. Things of that nature is what we have. And again, and what does that give you from an accuracy standpoint or latency standpoint, right? Because your latency is important. Your context windows are changing quite a bit depending on which model you use. So all this has gone into our initial design, and we've come up with a very, really good balanced solution. So that's why we're watching cost, but to the degree, given our optimizations before, we don't mind. With adoption, I mean, that's a good problem to have. We'd love to see that.
Indeed. Curious about what you see going forward. What's next in the plan? I mean, there's opportunities and personalization everywhere when it comes to this technology. What can we expect to see next?
Next, I would say we've started our journey with trip planning. We've done a lot of work on the content summarization side of the house. When I look at GenAI and strategy for Tripadvisor, it's in the three specific pillars. That's how I think about it. Number one pillar is around what are the end user, consumer, and partner facing applications. Trip planning is one, content is another one. The third one in that bucket, what we are really thinking about is what does that mean from a conversational interface standpoint, right? Which form factors, where do we want to surface conversational interface? Could be text, could be audio, could be whatever. What does that mean from a search standpoint, right? Does the search need to evolve and change? What kind of recommendations? Where do we want to surface those? And how do we do that? So all that is something we are thinking on the end user standpoint. That's our pillar one. Pillar number two is around productivity. You can argue and you can see already a lot of benefits of LLM based solutions helping developers code better, right? We've seen Copilot, what it can do. So we're looking into that. But even beyond one function, which is engineering, what does that mean? What kind of benefits you can have on sales and marketing and HR and finance, even analytics, right? With self-serve reporting and insights. So we're looking into that as a second pillar of a strategy. And that's something on the horizon. And lastly, how can we take our insights that we produce or the things we can do with LLM and externalize that, share this more broadly beyond our immediate product surfaces? So that's something also we are thinking about.
Wonderful. I love this idea that to a certain extent, you're actually bringing back the travel agent, but you're turning it into the travel agent that we always wanted, which is the one that would be infinitely more knowledgeable and infinitely more helpful and understood you much better. In a sense, that conversational engagement, that ability to interact with it is, in a sense, creating what would have been the epitome of the travel agent. Wonderful. What I would also love to take the opportunity to ask you about your role as effectively CDAO at such a digitally native tech company like Tripadvisor, but also you were in similar roles over at LinkedIn. But you have this great perspective because you can compare it to those roles in financial service. And often when I talk to CDAOs, they talk about, well, we'd love to do this like we would do at a tech company. Or they'd say, at tech companies, they don't have CDAOs. So my job is to put myself out of a job within 3 years. And I'm like, well, no, they do. And one example is yourself. How do you see the similarities or differences?
I think what this role in any industry, in my mind, what it can and should do, right? It boils down to two or three different things in my mind. Number one is that you look at this role and say, is it a technology? Is it a technical role? Is it a business role? And in my mind, it's just a really combination, right? And you think about any company, any industry, really the chief data officer or chief AI officer, you're not talking about a like tech for tech's sake, but just really what is the impact? What is the tangible business impact you can drive? And to me, that's not fully shared or well internalized aspects of the job. It's really you're almost operating as a GM of a business. You're GM of data. I mean, like, or and you think about your core assets or data, what you can do, and then data can mean like your core data assets and data engineering, your AI, your analytics, whatever you happen to have. But just really take all of that and then really what can you leverage? What can you drive from a business impact standpoint? What's the tangible revenue you can drive? What's the cost savings you can drive? And to me, that is a very important aspect of this role, is really have a solid thinking and orientation around driving P&L business impact. So that's one. Second is with this role, there's a certain level of transformation. I mean, any company I've been part of, no matter what, it's a fully established, digital native, data driven company to certain industries, which may not be the case. You are always driving some level of transformation with data. And you are looked at that internal change agent who can help drive that transformation. So really, to me, that is a really critical aspect of it. And you're looking at this internally, but also if you look at an external lens, you are being looked at as an innovation catalyst, right? Who is representing what is possible, what your company can do, what your industry can do, as that really the innovation expert. So the point number two is, and when you think about these roles or this role in particular, you're looked at like your transformation or change agent internally and both externally. And last but not least, in this role, even more so in the tech companies, you are the single point of contact when it comes to thinking about your regulations and risks and ethics. I mean, this is becoming a more of a notion now in the tech industry than it was before. I mean, this is kind of like something I'm seeing carry over or coming from the financial industry, where in the financial industry there are certain regulatory bodies you're held accountable to, and as a chief CDO, CDIO, or CD, whatever role you're in, you're doing certain things to mitigate and to address your obligations there, which was largely absent in the technology industry. But again, we see a lot of development, especially last week, EU passing, AI regulation or almost law now. What does that mean, right? So I think those are really, or even you think about responsible AI and ethics and trust and privacy, it's just becoming a bigger focus, and as it should be. Absolutely, it's most important to focus on. So in my mind, this role is and will focus on that as well. So that's how I think about this role. Really thinking about driving impact, thinking about innovation, change management, really driving transformation, and lastly, safeguarding user interest and what's the right thing to do for a company, for all stakeholders.
Well, I wish I was able to tell folks that it sounds like the role is becoming easier, but it sounds anything but. It sounds like you're tasked with going in and building that portfolio of data and AI products. It sounds like you're also being tasked with creating, for lack of a better term, the AI factory, the capabilities for going in and creating those on a repeatable basis, but also doing it in a responsible, governed way.
Yeah.
And if I were to try and summarize, it sounds like, well, the difference between the digitally native companies versus the traditional ones is that on that spectrum that a lot of CDOs have to cover of a shared service covering things like data governance and data availability through to data and AI products, at the digitally native firm, hopefully it sounds like, well, here the direction is very much on the side of creating that AI factory, that transformation with AI, and versus the the constant firefighting on the data governance and the providing that shared service that a lot of traditional organizations fit into. Or is that too much of an oversimplification?
No, I think that's right. That's right. And then what I would say is the role might not be getting easier, but I think it's getting very impactful, especially in this world right now, day and age where we look at everything which is driven by some aspects of data. This role in particular and the data function as in general, I would say it's getting more and more important and more impactful. So I'm quite excited about that.
My biggest prediction for AI in 2024 is that AI leaders will are already and become even more so the most important folks in the company.
Yes.
But Rahul, Thank you very, very much for your time and for joining us on the Data Science Leaders podcast. If folks want to reach out to you, is there a best way for them to get in touch? Is it through LinkedIn?
Yes, LinkedIn will be fantastic.
Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and my pleasure, and really enjoyed our conversation.
You've been listening to Data Science Leaders from Domino Data Lab. If you found our discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. Your support helps us deliver cutting-edge content and keep the data science community informed and inspired. We appreciate every review. Until next time.